Sources within the Department of Defense estimate that war with China is inevitable and likely to happen within 18 to 24 months from July of 2023. While the war will be costly, there's one undeniable fact: China is terrified of the U.S. Navy. But it doesn't mean that America will win. In any confrontation between the US and China, it's both sides' navies who do the bulk of the fighting and decide the very fate of the Pacific and beyond. If China wins, its authoritarian model will spread around the world as it uses its global near monopoly on semiconductors to bend nations to its whim. Think you're safe in Europe? Until Macron figures out how to run sensitive electronics off of croissants? Think again, because even our European cousins' fates are intertwined with America's struggle with China in the Pacific. America's win conditions for any war with China are resolute. Nothing less than the total destruction of the Chinese Navy and the Chinese Air Forces will do. While America isn't seeking confrontation, it has stated goals of what it will accomplish if it happens. The US will not broker any chance of a resurgent China challenging it again 2 decades later, in the style of early 20th century Germany. Thus, the US will seek to absolutely smash China's ability to project power past its own shores. Standing firmly in the US camp are Japan and Australia, and heavily favoring America, as well as treaty-bound to help defend it, are the Philippines and South Korea. That leaves China as the outlier in its own neighborhood, as every significant power on its block has opted to throw its lot in with the US. And while a comparison of both sides' navies is important, what's even more important is that the US will not be fighting alone. If China chooses to go to war, it'll be stepping into a cage match with no friends. Well, maybe North Korea if it's feeling particularly suicidal that day. So what does the tale of the tape tell us? One-on-one, the American and Chinese navies are the two most powerful naval forces in the world. China has pulled off nothing short of an economic and industrial miracle, growing its navy in 20 years from a brown water force incapable of challenging a single U.S. carrier strike group directly off its own shores to one that'll soon be a bona fide blue water navy capable of global operations. In numbers alone, China fields 730 ships versus America's 484, though these are not all fighting ships, as both navies have about as many support vessels as combat vessels. However, when it comes down to fighting ships, China outnumbers America. The Chinese have 78 submarines versus America's 68, 50 destroyers versus America's 92, 43 frigates versus 0 for the US, 72 corvettes versus America's 22, and 150 coastal patrol craft versus the US's 10. The only categories the US outnumbers China is in aircraft carriers with 11 versus 2, and amphibious assault ships, sometimes known as light carriers, with 9 versus 3. The Chinese Navy has more combat hulls than the US, prompting the Secretary of the Navy to comment that the US desperately needed to increase the size of its fleet, coupling his statement with the bad news that America cannot keep pace with the Chinese shipbuilding. However, that's not the full story, because when it comes to tonnage, the US Navy has nearly twice the tonnage of the Chinese Navy, and that matters when a significant amount of that tonnage comes from 11 American supercarriers, each fielding a small air force that on their own would be a formidable challenge for most nations' own air forces. The fact is, the US has fatter ships than China, which means they can take more punishment, have more capabilities, and field more weapons. 5 years ago, the US had nearly triple the number of battle force missiles than China, a total count of every type of missile a warship could carry. By 2030, China will have closed that gap significantly, but the US is still estimated to have a 50% lead. However, China is not resting on its laurels, and while the Pentagon wants 350 manned combat ships by 2045, China is projected to have 460 by 2030. The rate of production in China is incredible, with China pumping out about 20 warships a year, while the US struggles to get 6 out. It doesn't help that China has 13 shipyards, and most of them have more capacity than America's 8 shipyards. Just one has more capacity than all of American shipyards combined. But that's not the full story. During the Cold War, after all, the Soviets had a larger navy than America, but nobody would have ever argued the Soviet ships and submarines were an equal match to their American counterparts. The US is a firm believer in quality over quantity, and historically this has proven to not just be a war-winning strategy, but one that delivers extremely lopsided victories. While the newest batch of Chinese destroyers are featuring better radars than those present on older US hulls, the overall advantage is still squarely on the American side. The US also fields more and better missiles than China, and on a platform-to-platform basis, the advantage is almost always heavily in America's favor. But the US isn't resting on its heels, and the Navy has an ambitious program to tackle the numbers disparity between the two sides through technology, of course. Currently, the Navy is testing a variety of unmanned vessels that will one day soon be complementing U.S. task forces. Already, the Navy is using unmanned drones for aerial refueling of its combat aircraft, which frees up platforms which would normally be reserved for the role, increasing the overall power of each carrier's air wing. But soon drones will be doing everything from patrolling for enemy submarines to carrying out mining or demining duties, engaging in suicide attacks against high-value targets, and possibly even serving as nothing more than floating arsenal ships, drone platforms with as many as 500 vertical launch cells that will simply follow U.S. fleets around until they're needed to engage targets. America is betting big on unmanned tech to level the playing field between the two sides, because while having bigger, more capable ships is good, it also means that the loss of each individual ship is a bigger proportional loss of combat power. What if war broke out today, though? The regular and naval air forces of both sides would play heavily in any conflict in the South Pacific, and while China has made great strides, U.S. air forces still leave it in the dust. In 1996, most of the Chinese Air Force was made up of hopelessly obsolete second-generation aircraft, either direct purchases from the Soviet Union or copies produced under license or simply reverse-engineered and stolen by Chinese engineers. Today, over half of China's air forces are made up of fourth-generation platforms, with a growing fleet of fifth-generation J-20s, of which China is estimated to have around 200. To be fair, the J-20 is widely considered to be more of a 4.5 than a true fifth-generation design, as there are multiple features such as canards that are decidedly unstealthy. Much like the Russians, the Chinese have also found it difficult to master the production techniques required for the incredibly tight tolerances necessary for fifth-generation airframes, evidenced by visible seams in the aircraft's body panels which would increase its visibility versus radar. Materials technology also lags behind the US and the West overall, as does the development of advanced avionics and other sensors. Lastly, the J-20 has underpowered engines, as China has struggled to develop native engines that can match the performance of American engines. And it's not just sheer power, it's efficiency and reliability. One American F-16 pilot remarked how when speaking with Chinese pilots, they expressed shock and surprise when he informed them of his flight around the world in his F-16. Chinese engines are notoriously unreliable, and it's estimated that the Chinese would only get a few hours of combat time out of each engine before needing serious maintenance. As it stands, Chinese jet engine reliability is about 1/4 of American or European jet engines, a significant problem. Underpowered engines have also hamstrung the development of a true carrier fighter, with China's J-15 Flying Shark incapable of lifting the type of loads an American F-18 would, limiting either combat range or armament. China's engine problem stems from its history of imitating rather than innovating. Its most advanced engine, the WS-15, began development in the late 1990s and took flight in 2022 with the J-20. However, the engine has shown significant reliability problems as China copes with the power requirements of modern fighters. And that's a problem China is trying to correct by building relationships with foreign manufacturers and universities as it attempts to improve its human capital by sending students and trainees abroad. The United States has recognized this tactic and worked to limit the access Chinese students have to its aerospace industry and educational programs. Manufacturing is also a significant problem for China, as the world's most advanced machine tools are all foreign-made. China can source components for its engines on its own, but it relies on Western, Japanese, or Korean machines for manufacturing. Chinese aerospace firms are forced to import machine tools from German, Japanese, Italian, and South Korean firms, and this poses a critical risk to China. When Russia couldn't match the West's 5- and 7-axis machine tooling capabilities in the early 1990s and early 2000s, demand for its defense products shrank considerably. These high-precision machine tools are critical for the development of advanced aircraft structures, compressor blades, and inertial navigation systems. China is also struggling to figure out how to optimize its manufacturing process and has been attempting to steal secrets from the West for years. In 2018, Chinese-American Zhao Qingjiang was convicted by the Department of Justice for stealing trade secrets regarding turbine sealing. Chinese intelligence officer Xu Yangjung was discovered to be targeting experts from Western aerospace companies and plying them for sensitive manufacturing data and attempting to get them to speak to their Chinese counterparts to improve Chinese efficiency. Despite plenty of theft of intellectual property, the country is basically built on it, the one thing that China can't steal is expertise, and its native workforce lacks the decades of training and experience to properly implement the stolen knowledge. That situation is unlikely to change anytime soon, as China historically has a significant problem attracting talented immigrants. On an airframe basis, though, the US has a significant advantage over China, with a completely modern fleet that sees ongoing modernization efforts through either upgrade programs or the acquisition of new aircraft like the F-35. It's no secret that the US absolutely loves its air forces, and it fields nearly twice as many fighters as China does. It also has 7 times as many special mission aircraft critical for modern success than China does. Notable mentions, however, are the F-22 Raptor, which blows the J-20 out of the sky, literally, if it ever came down to it. The Raptor is facing a modernity problem, as its old architecture makes it prohibitively expensive to significantly upgrade its electronic brains, but it's still significantly more lethal than anything in the Chinese fleet. Even China's most advanced balloon technology is no match for the deadliest plane in the sky. The Raptor's ever-evolving little brother, though, is what China should be the most worried about. The F-35 is not as stealthy as the Raptor, but what it lacks in stealth it more than makes up for in literally everything else. The aircraft is designed from the ground up to be a true 21st century weapon. It features high levels of automation unmatched in any other platform, which lets the pilot focus on the job that matters, killing bad guys or avoiding being killed in return. A system of distributed cameras also allows its pilot to look through the frame of his own aircraft, giving him unparalleled situational awareness. But the F-35's real strength is its ability to speak with other weapon systems in the US arsenal, in effect making it a miniature airborne air traffic control. It can even guide the weapons fired by other aircraft or surface platforms to their targets, allowing it to use its stealth to penetrate into airspace that its fourth-generation cousins couldn't, while guiding their long-range weapons to targets it can see. But the US isn't done there, because even before the F-35 fully replaces that F-18 fleet, the US Navy is already designing its next-generation naval fighter. This 6th-generation aircraft is pure speculation at the moment, though the Air Force has confirmed that its own version has already been flying for about 2 years. What we do know is that the Navy wants to have a much greater range than either the F-18 or F-35, a greater payload capacity, and it needs to come with the capability of flying alongside drone wingmen. With Chinese anti-ship missiles and ever greater concern for the US Navy, future fighters will need to operate from carriers based further from hostile shores, necessitating a greater fuel capacity. Drone wingmen, meanwhile, will enable various capabilities on attribute platforms, which right now would need to be undertaken by expensive manned aircraft. Drones, for example, could use their own onboard radars for situational awareness, while allowing their manned mothership to keep hers powered down and retain her stealth. When it comes to hitting where it hurts, China has developed an impressive array of long-range anti-ship missiles. The YJ-12 is the primary weapon used by China's bombers and its large array of coastal missile batteries, with an estimated range of about 300 miles. It's a subsonic weapon, though, and thus vulnerable to robust American air defenses, though an ability to conduct a supersonic sprint in its terminal phase increases its lethality. The YJ-18 is the primary missile used by China's submarines and surface warships and is capable of being fired from vertical launch cell systems. It features a range of about 330 miles and is also a subsonic weapon with the ability to perform a supersonic sprint in its terminal phase. The YJ-83 is fielded on Chinese attack aircraft and smaller surface warships. It only has a range of 110 miles and is a purely subsonic weapon. This is the equivalent of bringing a knife to a gunfight, though, and it's unlikely any Chinese aircraft or ship could survive within 110 miles of a large American surface action group. The DF-21 and DF-26, however, have been termed carrier killers and are truly up to the task, at least on paper. These large ballistic missiles are launched from land-based platforms and feature a range of 930 and 1,850 miles respectively, putting even targets far out at sea at significant risk. They are hypersonic weapons, though only in the sense that they are ballistic missiles which reach hypersonic speeds. Being ballistic weapons, though, they fly in a predictable path, making them vulnerable to US air defense missiles. China's only modern hypersonic anti-ship missile, the YJ-21, was only revealed in 2022. Details about this weapon remain shrouded in mystery, but China claims that it's a true modern hypersonic weapon defined by the ability to maneuver at hypersonic speeds, something ballistic missiles can't do. It's this maneuverability and extreme speed that makes these types of weapons so dangerous, as it makes intercepting them incredibly difficult. However, the YJ-21 has not been deployed in large numbers, and its capabilities, range, and lethality are completely unknown. What is known is that modern hypersonic weapons are incredibly expensive, and it's not economically possible to field them in large numbers. That's why the US has dropped some of its own hypersonic programs, opting instead to increase the penetrability of its next-generation conventional missiles. The US has relied on the Harpoon anti-ship missile for decades. A Cold War stalwart, the Harpoon is a capable weapon, but one that faces increasingly more sophisticated air defenses. This is why the US Navy has begun fielding a completely new weapon, its first new anti-ship missile since the Cold War, and it's planning to field them in large numbers, with producer Lockheed Martin opening a second production line to make both the long-range anti-ship missile, or LRASM, and its air-launched variant used by both the U.S. Air Force and the U.S. Navy, the Air-to-Air Standoff Missile Extended Range, or JASSM-ER. With things heating up in the Pacific, the U.S. has realized that its current stockpile of anti-ship missiles will likely not be enough for a protracted conflict. Now, Lockheed Martin is projected to be building 1,000 LRASMs and JASSMers a year. These advanced weapons feature stealth characteristics that significantly reduce an enemy's engagement time, increasing the probability of penetrating air defenses. However, being stealthy weapons means they're limited to subsonic speeds, but that also means that they use regular jet engines rather than rocket motors, which greatly increases their range compared to Chinese missiles. The JASSMer is specially designed to be launched by aircraft well outside of China's increasing anti-access area denial capabilities, estimated at over 575 miles, or over twice that of the LRASM. But the US isn't completely out of the hypersonic game despite scrapping their air-launched rapid response weapon. Instead, it's focused efforts on building an air-breathing hypersonic missile named the Hypersonic Air-Launched Anti-Surface Warfare, or HALO missile. Still deeply in testing phases, the aim is to produce a financially responsible hypersonic weapon that can be built in significant numbers, a true challenge for any hypersonic weapon. As the LRASM builds in numbers, though, the Harpoon is receiving upgrades to make it more relevant on modern battlefields. Its Block 2 Plus upgrade includes a new GPS receiver and flight control system, which will help it find targets in a complicated environment, as well as a two-way data link to allow it to be retargeted in flight, and an infrared seeker for all-weather capability. However, the Harpoon is old tech, and Navy war games show it, which is why the LRASM is being rushed into production today. With a host of new weapons on the way and significant legacy capability receiving upgrades, the US Navy is a terrifying force to reckon with, even given China's superior numbers. More importantly, the US will not fight this war alone and can count on a number of allies and partners to shore up its own numbers. In the end, that is the secret to the US's true lethality and a capability that no amount of espionage or industrial theft will ever deliver to China. Now go check out why Putin is scared of Ukraine's counteroffensive, or click this other video instead.